Puppy was buried alive in a hole and desperately barks for someone to help her. What happened next will break her heart. Have you ever come across a scene that made your heart stop for a moment? Something so cruel and unexpected that it made your stomach turn. And for a brief moment you had to blink several times, trying to convince yourself that it wasn't real, as if it were a nightmare from which you would wake up at any second. But the chill down your spine and the tightness in your chest said otherwise. It was really happening. Some stories are hard to believe. Some pain seems so inhumane that we wonder how the world can be so unfair. But at the same time, there are stories that remind us that, even in the midst of darkness, life always finds a way to surprise. This is the story of a little warrior, a cub who knew nothing about the world other than hunger, cold, and loneliness. But despite everything, he still had something inside him that no one could destroy: the desire to live. The night was bitter. The wind cut like invisible blades, penetrating to the bone. The streets were empty. Only shadows stretched beneath the streetlights, creating distorted shapes on the sidewalk. The silence was frightening, interrupted only by a distant bark, perhaps from another dog that, like him, was fighting to survive in that large and indifferent city. In the middle of that desolate scenery, a small cub walked alone. His steps were shaky. His fragile paws trembled with each new step on the cold asphalt. Her thin little body seemed even smaller beneath the dirty, matted fur, which might once have been fluffy and soft. His eyes, large and expressive, revealed a mixture of innocence and fear, but also a stubborn hope, as if he still believed that somewhere someone would look at him with affection. The puppy sniffed the ground desperately, looking for anything that could satisfy the unbearable hunger that burned its empty stomach. But there was nothing. Just unreachable remains, torn garbage bags and strong odors that didn't serve as food. He continued walking, ignoring the fatigue that weighed on his small paws, because he had no choice. Stopping meant giving up. He had no name. I didn't have a home. Perhaps he had already had a mother, siblings, a warm place to sleep, but that memory, if it existed, was already too distant. All he knew now was rejection. All I felt was abandonment. With each step, the smell of food coming from the houses warmed his heart for a brief moment, until reality hit him. The doors remained closed. The happy voices that came from inside the houses would never call out to him. His little tail wagged in the hope that someone would see him, that a single hand would reach out to him. But all he received were indifferent looks, people hurriedly avoiding his path, some even grumbling, others pushing him away with a light kick. He didn't understand. I didn't understand why no one wanted him. What had he done wrong? He just wanted some food, a place to rest, a little love. But fate, that night, would not be kind to him. In a dark alley, hidden from the city light, he found someone. His curious eyes found a man leaning against the wall, holding a bottle in his hand. The strong smell of alcohol mixed with the stench of trash bags spread across the floor. The puppy hesitated for a moment, but then wagged its tail. Maybe that man could be her chance. He didn't seem to be in a hurry. He didn't seem indifferent like the others. Who knows? If he stayed there, if he looked at him with those innocent eyes, maybe that would be the moment when, finally, someone would see him. But the only response he received was a blank stare, a soulless look, without any trace of compassion. And then, without warning, the man moved, and at that moment the puppy felt for the first time in his life what true fear was. Dogs ask for nothing more than love, but often receive only contempt. This puppy could have been forgotten forever, but his story deserves to be told. Comment, I believe in the power of love. Like and subscribe if you love animals, and believe that more people should see stories like these and learn to care for and protect animals. The cub backed away, its fragile little body shaking with each step back. Her eyes, large and bright, reflected pure fear, while her once hopeful tail now curled between her legs. He didn't understand. He didn't understand why that man didn't offer him affection, a kind look, or even a piece of stale bread. But before he could run away, rough and merciless hands grabbed him brutally. The puppy struggled, its high-pitched barks cutting through the silence of the alley, mixed with small, desperate whines. Its little paws clawed at the air, trying to free itself, but there wasn't enough strength in its thin body to fight against that cruel grip. The strong smell of alcohol permeated the man's skin. His trembling fingers sloppily squeezed the puppy, as if he were holding something disposable. His lost look reflected nothing but the emptiness of a soul hardened by time and his own mistakes. The puppy, in his naive heart, still hoped that this was just a mistake, that man would release him in a moment. Perhaps he would realize that he posed no threat. But no. What came next was unthinkable. The man, still holding the cub like a worthless piece of rag, knelt on the dry dirt floor and began to dig. His rough fingers sank into the hard earth, pulling out entire clods with a strange haste, a silent fury that only he understood. The cub, now motionless in pure terror, looked around, looking for a familiar face, a pair of hands to rescue him, anything that would save him from that unknown fate. But there was no one there. Just him, the man, and that hole getting deeper and deeper. When the hole seemed deep enough, the man, without hesitation, threw the cub inside. The small body fell onto the damp floor with a thud. The fright made him let out a short bark. But before he could react, a handful of cold, heavy earth hit his back. He shook himself, tried to run to the sides, tried to dig with his little paws, but every movement seemed futile. The dirt continued to fall, covering his dirty, fine fur, weighing down his body. He tried to bark, but his voice was muffled by the weight of the earth that now covered his snout. The cub fought. He tried to get out of there. He struggled, dug, cried, but it was so small, so fragile. The earth seemed infinite, and the darkness suffocating. His heart was beating fast, his lungs were begging for air. He didn't know how long he had spent there. I didn't know if it was night or day. I didn't know if anyone was coming. All I knew was that the cold of the land didn't seem so bad anymore, that the pain of hunger and fear was fading. Little by little, his breathing became slower. His small body, previously so restless, stopped fighting. The cold became a sleepy embrace, an almost welcoming sensation. His eyes, once wide with panic, began to close. For the first time, he didn't feel hungry. For the first time, he didn't feel afraid. And for once, he wasn't fighting. Silence can be one of the scariest things there is. Sometimes it comes as a warning, an unsettling pause before something happens. Other times it's just the end, an emptiness where there once was life, a definitive silence that spreads like a shadow, erasing any hope. That night, on that small piece of upturned earth, silence seemed to reign supreme. No barking, no crying, just the cold weight of the ground covering a little body that should have been running and playing, but now lay motionless, buried beneath the cruelty of a world that ignored it. The cub couldn't see anything anymore. The darkness was total. Where before there was the dim light of the streetlights, the shadows of the alleys, and the glow of the moon reflecting on the wet asphalt, now there was only a deep, suffocating pitch black. His small body was paralyzed, compressed by the weight of the earth that was swallowing him inch by inch. With each attempt to move, he felt even more trapped, as if the earth itself was determined to keep him there, with no chance of escape. His lungs were begging for air, but there was no more room to breathe. The cold that had previously made his body shiver began to disappear, giving way to a strange heat that spread inside, as if his own body was giving up the fight. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. His heart, previously racing with fear, began to beat slower. His thoughts, once confused and desperate, became distant, as if they were going somewhere else, far away. The cub didn't know what was happening, but the pain of hunger and rejection no longer seemed so strong. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel anything, but deep down, where the earth had not yet fully reached, a spark of life still shone. It was small, faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A part of him, perhaps the most primitive, perhaps the purest, still refused to accept that fate. The life inside him screamed. He tried to move his paw. He didn't make it. He tried to open his mouth to bark, to ask for help, but his voice wouldn't come out. All he could do was hold on to that little spark inside him, that tiny flame that still burned, insisting that he not give up. But who would come? Who would find him there, in the middle of nowhere, underground? Do you think that will this cub survive? If so, leave a comment saying, "Strength, little warrior." Show your support for this puppy, who represents all the abandoned and abused dogs around the world, who just need someone to give them a chance and a little love. Outside, the world continued. The wind shook the trees. Some windows lit up with life inside the houses. People hurried past without ever imagining what was happening beneath that ground. The city continued its indifferent rhythm, while beneath the hearth a small heart still struggled to keep beating. It was then that something happened. A slight vibration ran through the floor. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't a tremor. It was something smaller, more subtle. Steps, small and barefoot, light as the touch of the wind on the dust. The sound echoed across the vacant lot, mixing with the distant chirp of a cricket and the whisper of rustling leaves. They were baby steps. Fate sometimes plays with the unexpected. While in a corner of that land, a small being fought silently against the darkness that swallowed him. A few meters away, a boy walked, oblivious to everything. He kicked pebbles along the way, distracted, like any child who enjoys his free time without worries. The wind ruffled her hair, the sun warmed her skin, and the earth beneath her feet was nothing but ordinary ground. For him, this was just another ordinary day. But he didn't know. He didn't know that every step he took led to an encounter that would change his life. I didn't know that beneath that dry, beaten earth, a fragile little heart was beating slower and slower. He didn't know that beneath him a life was about to disappear, but fate knew. And then, for no apparent reason, the boy stopped. It was a tiny moment, just any second, but it made all the difference between life and death. His foot hung in the air for a brief moment before touching the ground again. Something made him stop. There was no sound. There was no voice. Just a sudden instinct, an inexplicable feeling that something wasn't right. His gaze slowly descended, analyzing the land in front of him. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but something caught his attention. A small mound of dirt stood out from the rest. It looked disturbed, as if someone had recently disturbed the soil. It was not like the other pieces of dry, hard ground in that forgotten land. It had a different shape, a strange texture. The boy frowned, feeling his heart speed up without knowing why. Curious, he knelt down slowly, ignoring the roughness of the earth scratching his knees. His hand hesitated for a second before sliding over the ground. What he felt was different from what he expected. The earth was softer there, lighter, as if it was hiding something, as if there was something alive there. And then he saw it, a small movement, almost nothing, just a subtle tremor in the earth, a slight shift, imperceptible to anyone who wasn't looking directly at it. But the boy saw. His heart raced immediately, as if his own body had understood what that meant before his mind did. His eyes blinked a few times, as if trying to confirm whether what he had just witnessed was real or just a cruel game of his imagination. But it was no illusion. There it was again, a slight tremor beneath the earth, a weak signal, a silent cry for help. His chest rose and fell rapidly. A chill ran down his spine, making every hair on his body stand on end. But it wasn't fear. It was something different, something he had never felt before. An unknown urgency, as if, in some inexplicable way, he knew there was not a second to waste. His childish instinct, so pure and free from doubt, screamed at him to act. Without thinking twice, he started digging. His fingers dug into the dry earth hard, pulling out handfuls of soil as if his very life depended on it. The floor was hard in some parts, crumbly in others. His nails soon became covered in dirt. Small cuts began to appear on his fingers, but he didn't care. Sweat ran down his forehead, mixing with the rising dust as he dug with increasing desperation. His heart beat in his chest like a racing drum. Something inside him screamed to keep going, not to hesitate, not to let this moment be wasted. Every second was an eternity. And then, as if fate had been waiting just for that moment, something appeared, a little snout, covered in dust. Property. The world seemed to stop for a second. The boy's eyes widened. His breath caught in his throat. He dug faster, now feeling the pain of the scratches on his hands, but it didn't matter. Nothing else mattered other than that little being, that creature that, until a few seconds ago, no one knew existed. With each handful of dirt removed, more of the fragile little body was revealed. First a little paw, dirty, thin, still inert. Then another, a thin back covered in dirt. A small, lifeless tail. Despair squeezed the boy's heart like an invisible fist. He swallowed hard. His chest burned from rapid breathing, and a horrible thought crossed his mind. What if it was too late? And then, the impossible happened. The cub breathed. It was weak, almost imperceptible. A small movement of the nostrils, a breath of life so delicate that it could have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not for him. The boy's eyes widened even more, his chest rising and falling irregularly, as if he himself was struggling to breathe along with the puppy. A sob caught in his throat, and he didn't even notice when his eyes started to fill with tears. Relief mixed with despair took over his body. Without hesitation, he picked up the small body with all the care in the world. The puppy's frightening lightness made a lump form in his throat. He weighed almost nothing, just a handful of fragile bones covered in dust and pain. The boy pressed him against his chest gently, as if he wanted to protect him from the world, as if he wanted to give him back everything they had taken. But the puppy didn't react. Panic rose within him. I couldn't waste time. He needs help. His scream tore through the silence of the wasteland like thunder, his voice carrying an urgency so pure and genuine that no one could ignore it. And then, as if that call had awakened something around, doors began to open. From inside the modest houses, people came out, their expressions full of confusion and concern. A lady came hurriedly, carrying an old blanket in her trembling hands. A man appeared, holding a bowl of water. Children who had previously played distractedly now watched in silence, feeling the tension in the air. The boy looked around, feeling the weight of that moment. The world seemed to have gone silent for a brief moment, as if it was holding its breath along with him. The puppy, fragile and almost without strength, was still there, wrapped in his small, trembling arms. His heart pounded loudly, echoing inside his chest like a beatless drum, while his eyes roamed over the people who, little by little, approached. He was not alone. His dirt-smeared fingers pressed delicately around the light little body. The feeling of thin, cold skin beneath his hands made his chest tighten even more. The cub was so small, so thin, so fragile. How could anyone just bury him? How could anyone look at those little closed eyes, at that motionless tail, and decide that he no longer deserved to exist? The injustice of that reality burned inside him in a way he couldn't explain, but at the same time something bigger was growing inside his chest, because he was there, and the cub, against all odds, was still breathing. The air escaped the small nostrils with difficulty, a light breath, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was a thread of life, a flicker of existence that had not completely gone out. The boy felt a lump tighten in his throat. How could something so weak be so strong at the same time? How could such a small being carry such resistance within itself? The cub, who should have been forgotten beneath the cold earth, was now there in the arms of someone who cared. He was still breathing. It still existed. He still fought. Every faint beat of his heart was proof that he hadn't given up. Even when everything said he had no more chances, even when his strength abandoned him, something inside him still refused to give in. Fate had thrown him deep into the ground, covered in darkness and loneliness. The world had rejected him, tried to erase him, but love, even if late, brought him back. The boy felt the weight of that truth take over every cell in his body. The little being in his arms wasn't just any puppy. He was a survivor. He was a miracle. And now, finally, I was no longer alone. The boy's gaze lifted again, and he saw the people around him. The lady who was carrying a blanket, her eyes teary when she noticed the scene. The man holding the water bowl, his lips pursed in concern. The children, who had previously played carefree, now watched in silence, absorbing every detail of that moment. They were feeling it too. They were also connecting with that little miracle, and for the first time, the boy realized the impact of a single act of compassion. Maybe if he hadn't stopped, if he hadn't looked at that pile of dirt, if his instincts hadn't screamed inside him, no one would have ever found the cub. He would have disappeared there, underground, without anyone knowing his story. But he was seen. He was saved. There, in the warm, trembling arms of that child, the puppy found something he had never felt before, hope. And in that moment, even without words, he knew he would never be alone again. Some things in life happen in a matter of seconds, but are marked forever. The moment the boy saw that small, motionless body, covered in dirt and dust, was one of those moments. The puppy didn't move. He didn't make a sound, but he was breathing. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a breath of life that insisted on existing. The boy's heart was beating so hard that he felt his pulse vibrating in his ears. The lump in his throat grew. Tears, hot and unexpected, stung her eyes. But it was not the time to cry. Not now. He needed help. Holding the cub with all the care in the world, as if any sudden movement could make it disappear, he jumped up and ran. He ran without looking back, without thinking about anything other than the only thing that really mattered at that moment, saving that little life that now depended entirely on him. His bare feet slapped against the hard ground of the wasteland. Dust rose around him, but he didn't care. His only focus was finding someone who could help. "Help! Someone help me!" His voice echoed through the neighborhood, mixing with the distant birdsong and the rustle of dry leaves that rustled along the ground. At first, no one responded. Fear rose within him. What if it was too late? What if no one cared? But then, a door creaked open. A grey head appeared. Eyes crinkled with concern as she took in the scene before her. It was Mr. Antonio, a neighbor everyone knew, a simple man with hands calloused from work, but who always had a kind look in his eyes. The boy ran to him, holding the cub like a fragile treasure, his eyes pleading before he could even say anything. "Please, he needs help." Mr. Antonio did not hesitate. In a quick gesture, he took the puppy from the boy's hands and looked at it carefully. The seconds seemed to drag by as he watched. That small creature, so weak, so silent. Then, to everyone's surprise, the puppy let out a low moan. The air seemed to return to the boy's lungs. He was alive. It was faint, just a hoarse, almost indistinguishable sound, but to them, it was like hearing a scream. It was proof that he was still there, fighting to stay in this world. Mr. Antonio carefully passed his hand over the dirty, shaking body, feeling the small bones protruding under the thin skin. He was too thin. His small body, which should have been firm and full of energy, was just a handful of bones covered in dust. "He needs water," said Mr. Antonio, already hurriedly turning back into the house. The boy followed closely, his heart still pounding, but now with a ray of hope. Inside the simple and welcoming house, Mr. Antonio took a bowl and filled it with some fresh water. The boy watched expectantly as he wet his fingertips and gently touched the cub's dry snout. At first, there was no reaction. Silence settled in, again threatening to bring with it fear. But then slowly the cub moved its tongue. It was a minimal movement, almost invisible, but enough to make the boy let out a relieved sigh. "That's it, boy. You can do it," murmured Mr. Antonio, encouraging the puppy as if he could understand every word. Little by little, the little one began to react. His chest rose and fell more regularly. His eyes, previously completely closed, tried to open, still heavy and tired. The boy held his breath with each. Small progress, as if any wrong movement could break that fragile moment. He wanted that puppy so badly to be okay, more than anything else. But then, Mr. Antonio frowned. "His body is very cold," he said, his voice thick with concern. The boy felt his chest tighten again. Sure, he was off the ground, but that didn't mean he was out of danger. He was still so weak. His breathing, although present, was short and irregular. His eyes remained heavy, struggling to stay open. The boy swallowed. "Will he survive?" His voice was lower than he intended, filled with fear. Mr. Antonio sighed, covering the puppy with a soft cloth to try to warm him up. "I don't know, kid, but he wants to live, and that's a good start." The boy nodded, swallowing the lump that formed in his throat. He refused to accept any other possibility. The cub had fought so hard, he had withstood the worst. It wasn't fair that now, so close to a second chance, he was leaving. "We have to do more," he insisted, his pleading, eyes meeting Mr. Antonio's. The old neighbor smiled slightly. "Then let's do it." From that moment on, the little cub went from being just another abandoned animal to becoming a symbol of struggle. With every small movement, with every breath, he proved that he was still there, clinging to life with all his strength. But there were still uncertainties. His body was too weak. His little heart was racing too much. Time would tell if he would really be able to win that battle. And in the meantime, the boy wouldn't leave his side. He knew the cub had survived the worst. But now he needed something he never had before: love, care, and a reason to keep fighting. And deep down, the boy knew he would do anything to be that reason. Have you ever held something so fragile that you were afraid it would break just by touching it? Something so small, so delicate, that it seemed made of thin glass, ready to break at the slightest movement. That was exactly how the boy felt when he held that puppy in his arms. His breathing was short, his eyes were half closed, his body was so light that it seemed to have no substance. The little dog was still there, but for how long? Fear rose again in the boy's chest. He had taken it from the earth, but what if it wasn't enough? What if it had been too late? The approaching neighbors brought with them a mix of shock and urgency. An elderly woman with wrinkled hands and a look full of concern ran to the house and returned with an old but soft blanket. Without hesitation, he wrapped the fabric around the puppy, trying to offer some warmth to its cold, trembling little body. The boy tightened his arms around him, holding him against his chest, in an attempt to transmit some of his own body heat to him. "He needs water," said a man, bringing a small bowl. The boy watched, his heart pounding in his chest, as a woman wet her fingertips and tried to lightly touch the cub's dry snout. At first, there was no reaction. The silence was distressing. But then, after what seemed like an eternity, the little tongue moved almost imperceptibly, trying to absorb the moisture. It was enough for everyone around to hold their breath. He still wanted to live. The boy bent down, watching the cub's every little movement, trying to catch any signs of improvement. But with each attempt to open his eyes, his eyelids felt heavy like lead. His little body remained too soft, as if any remaining strength had been sucked away by the terrifying experience of being buried alive. He didn't even have the strength to react. "We need to take him to a veterinarian," said Mr. Antonio, his voice firm but full of concern. The boy's heart skipped a beat. Yes, of course. A veterinarian. Someone who knew what to do, who could truly save him. But where? The neighborhood where they lived was simple. There was no veterinary clinic nearby. The closest one was too far to walk. And even worse, how would they arrive in time? Some people are born with a different heart. A heart that, even in the face of difficulties, does not hesitate to reach out to those who need it most. Sometimes these are the people who appear at the most unlikely times, in the most unexpected places, changing destinies that seemed sealed. That day, while the neighbors looked at the fainting puppy, and the boy despaired when he realized he had no way of taking him to the city, it was a simple man who made the most important decision. Mr. Antonio was not rich. In fact, he barely had enough. There himself, his hands, calloused by time and hard work, were always busy with small repairs in the neighborhood, trying to ensure a modest livelihood. But when he looked at that helpless puppy, wrapped in the worn blanket, something inside him spoke louder. The money didn't matter, it didn't matter the distance. What mattered was that this little life still had a chance. Without saying anything, he took the dog from the boy's arms and held it with almost paternal care. His rough fingers touched the thin, cold little body, and in that instant he knew he couldn't leave him there waiting for the worst. "I'm going to take him to the vet," he said, his voice firm but full of kindness. The boy's eyes widened. "But how?" Mr. Antonio looked at his old bicycle, leaning against a nearby wall. The rusty frame betrayed years of use. The pedals creaked whenever he pushed them too hard. But that bike had never failed him. If she took him to work every day, she could take him to the veterinary clinic. "I'll find a way," he replied. The boy felt immense relief, but at the same time his heart sank. He knew that Mr. Antonio had no money left. He knew that, for a humble man like him, spending on a stray dog might mean giving up something essential for himself. But I also knew there was no stopping him. "I'll help you pay later," the boy said, feeling his voice breaking. Mr. Antonio smiled slightly. "We'll see about that later. First, let's save this little one." Without wasting any more time, he got on the bike, holding the puppy against his chest with one hand and guiding the handlebars with the other. The boy saw him disappear down the road, pedaling as fast as his tired legs would allow, not caring about the dust rising, not caring about the effort. All that mattered was arriving on time. The trip to the city was longer than expected. The sun was burning in the sky, and sweat was running down Mr. Antonio's face. His heart was pounding, not just from effort, but from anxiety. He felt the puppy's small body against his chest, almost motionless. At times I thought he wasn't breathing anymore, and my chest tightened with fear. But then he felt a faint sigh, a slight tremor, and he pedaled even harder. When he finally arrived at the veterinary clinic, he jumped off his bike before even parking it properly. He ran inside, his lungs burning, the puppy still clutched to his chest. "He needs help," he said, panting. The receptionist looked at the sweaty man and the small dog in his arms and didn't ask any questions, just called the vet immediately. The team took the puppy inside, and for the first time in hours, Mr. Antonio could do nothing but wait. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. He sat on the hard chair in the waiting room, rubbing his hands, his gaze fixed on the door that led to the reception area. He had never felt so helpless, until finally the vet came out. "He's still very weak," said the man in the white coat, his expression serious. "We did the first tests and found a problem. He swallowed a lot of soil." Mr. Antonio's heart seemed to stop for an instant. "At any moment he could suffocate," the veterinarian continued. "We need to act quickly." Without hesitation, the team began the procedures. A tube was carefully inserted to try and remove excess soil from the small organism. Every second was tense. Mr. Antonio watched from afar, feeling a growing tightness in his chest. The cub was there, so small, so vulnerable, but still fighting. The veterinarians tried to hydrate him with serum and tried to stabilize his breathing, but he was still too weak. The silence in the room was almost unbearable. Mr. Antonio closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He was not a man of many words, nor of great demonstrations, but in that moment, he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He prayed. I didn't. To know who to, I didn't know exactly what to ask. He just wished with all his heart that that little being had one more chance. Time seemed to have stopped. The team continued working, each one focused, each one trying to save a life that, for many, might not be worth anything. But for that simple man and that boy who had stayed behind, waiting for a miracle, that puppy was everything. And then, something happened. A sound, weak, choked, but audible. The cub let out a small whine. The vet quickly turned to the team. "He's reacting." Mr. Antonio held his breath. "He's not out of the woods yet," the vet explained, his voice now a little more animated. "But he's fighting." Mr. Antonio passed his hand over his sweaty face, feeling relief take over his chest. He still didn't know what would happen. I still didn't know if that little warrior would be able to overcome everything, but at that moment, he knew he wasn't alone in the fight. And the cub, against all odds, knew it too. He wouldn't give up, because for the first time there was someone fighting for him. Sometimes life surprises us at the most unlikely moments. When everything seems lost, when the last hopes begin to crumble like sand between your fingers, something happens. Something small, almost imperceptible, but that changes everything. In that treatment room, where every second seemed to drag on like an eternity, everyone was trapped in the same expectation. The puppy was there, so small on the cold table, surrounded by anxious eyes and experienced hands that did everything to keep him in the world of the living. But doubt hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Could he do it? Would all that effort have been in vain? Mr. Antonio felt his heart beating hard inside his chest, as if each beat was a silent plea. He wasn't a man of great demonstrations, but anyone who looked at him at that moment would see his fingers intertwined, pressing against each other, as if they were trying to hold on to something invisible. His gaze was fixed on the cub, that little warrior who had already faced so much. The silence in the room was piercing. Everyone held their breath, waiting for any sign, any small indication that he was still there. And then it happened. First, an almost imperceptible movement. A subtle tremor ran through his thin body, something so small that it could have gone unnoticed if it weren't for the attentive gaze of those who were rooting for him so much. A second later, a faint sound, a low, hoarse whimper, as if every breath he took was a fight against what was trying to take him. Time seemed to freeze. Everyone in the room looked at each other as if they needed confirmation that they had actually heard that. But before anyone could say anything, another sound came, and then another. It was real. He was crying. Mr. Antonio's breath caught in his throat. He blinked a few times, feeling his eyes burn with emotion. He never thought that the simple sound of such a weak moan could have such a huge impact inside him, but it did, and around him everyone seemed to feel the same. The vet smiled slightly, shaking his head in a mix of surprise and relief. The receptionist, who had previously just watched from a distance, placed her hand on her chest as if she were holding her own heart, and then another miracle came. The puppy's tail twitched. It was a weak movement, a minimal lifting, A still, hesitant attempt, but it was enough. A wave of emotion ran through the room. Mr. Antonio took a step forward, almost without realizing it. He wanted to touch him, he wanted to hold that little being and tell him that he no longer needed to fight alone. He wanted to say that now, finally, someone was there for him. The vet rushed to check his vitals again. "He's reacting faster than we expected," he said, without hiding his admiration. "This little one has impressive strength." Mr. Antonio closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing those words. That puppy's life had been marked by abandonment, pain, indifference. But against all odds, he was still there. I still wanted to live. "Is he going to be okay?" Mr. Antonio's voice came out almost like a whisper. The vet took a deep breath. "It's too early to say," he answered honestly. "He needs care, he needs to regain his strength. But if he's made it this far, if he's withstood everything he's been through, then I'd say his chances are only increasing by the minute." Mr. Antonio felt something tighten in his chest. Hope. He looked at the puppy again, and in that instant he saw not just a dog fighting to survive, but a symbol of something greater. That small animal, so fragile and vulnerable, had been buried as if its existence had no value. But he refused to disappear. He refused to be erased. And now, against all expectations, he was there, breathing, moving, fighting. Mr. Antonio realized that he had not just saved that puppy. He had been saved by him too, because somehow that little animal had shown him something he didn't know he needed to see. The strength of resilience, the beauty of a second chance. He approached slowly, afraid of disturbing any procedure, but the vet noticed and smiled. "You can touch it," he said. Gently, almost afraid of breaking it, Mr. Antonio reached out and placed his fingers on the puppy's head. The fur was rough, dirty, but at that moment, nothing seemed more precious. The puppy let out a sigh, and, as if feeling the touch of someone who now cared about him, he moved his head, instinctively seeking the warmth of that hand. Mr. Antonio couldn't help it. A smile appeared on his lips. "Welcome back, little one," he murmured. And at that moment, inside that room where before there was only uncertainty, something changed. The fear was replaced by relief. Desperation gave way to hope. And that puppy, who had been condemned to oblivion, now had a future ahead of him. He still needed care. There was still a difficult road ahead. But now, there was someone willing to walk alongside him. And sometimes that's all we need to survive. Names have power. They carry stories, meanings, and memories. They are often the first thing that defines us, that gives us identity. But what happens when a name represents more than that? And when does it symbolize a new chance, a fresh start, a rebirth? Mr. Antonio had never stopped to think much about names before. To him, dogs were dogs, and if they had a name, great. But if they didn't, they would still be special. But that puppy, that little being that fought against death and won, couldn't just be any dog. He needed a name that did justice to his story. The vet had already given all the instructions. The puppy would need a lot of care, special food, rest, and above all, love. Mr. Antonio listened to everything attentively, absorbing every word, but deep down, he already knew the answer to the question that had not yet been asked. The veterinarian looked at him and asked in a gentle tone, "Do you have someone who can take care of him?" Mr. Antonio looked at the small body wrapped in the blanket. The cub slept soundly, breathing rhythmically, as if, for the first time in his short life, he was safe. He was so small, so fragile, but at the same time, he carried immense strength within him. How could anyone have decided he didn't deserve to live? Mr. Antonio cleared his throat before responding, as if he were preparing to take on something much bigger than himself. "He already has a home," he said, his voice firm but full of emotion. The vet smiled, and the receptionist, who was watching everything, let out a sigh of relief. But Mr. Antonio wasn't looking at them. His eyes were fixed on the little puppy, who at that moment turned his little body slightly, making himself better comfortable on the blanket. Now he had a home. Now he had someone who would protect him. But something was still missing. The way home was different this time. There was no rush. There was no despair. Mr. Antonio pedaled slowly, feeling the wind hit his face, but without that overwhelming urgency that he had felt before. In the middle of the journey, he stopped the bike for a moment and looked at the puppy that was now resting safely inside the improvised basket. He breathed calmly, no more groans of pain, no more shivering from the cold. For the first time, he was simply resting, without fear that the worst was waiting for him. And it was there, in that moment of silence, that Mr. Antonio found out. "Phoenix," he murmured, testing the name on his lips. The puppy didn't react, but Mr. Antonio smiled to himself. Phoenix. The name of those who are reborn, those who face fire and emerge stronger. The names of those who should have disappeared, but defied all odds and returned to rewrite their history. The name of a survivor. Upon arriving home, the boy who had found the puppy ran to the entrance, his eyes shining with expectation. He had been waiting for news since Mr. Antonio had left, unable to think of anything else. When he saw the man getting off the bike with the puppy in his arms, a mixture of relief and joy took over his face. "Is he okay?" Mr. Antonio nodded, and before he could say anything, the boy approached carefully, looking at the small animal with indescribable affection. "Does he have a name?" he asked softly. Mr. Antonio looked at the puppy once again and then replied, "Phoenix." The boy blinked, absorbing the meaning of that word. After a moment he smiled. "Phoenix," he repeated, as if he were engraving that name in his heart. From that day on, the cub was no longer just a survivor. He was Phoenix, a symbol of resistance, of struggle, of second chances. He was no longer just a dog that was abandoned, buried, and forgotten. He was a dog who was reborn, who came back to life when no one else believed it was possible. And now, for the first time, he had a home. And above all, he had a name. Some stories don't end when everything seems to be fine. Sometimes there are shadows that still need to be dispelled, truths that need to be revealed. And while Phoenix finally found the warmth of home, there was something in the air, a silent unrest that hung over the residents of the neighborhood. Something that could not be ignored. The puppy's name was already starting to spread throughout the neighborhood. Phoenix, he who was reborn from the ashes, the little dog who was buried alive but refused to accept his fate. Many already knew his story, the desperation of the boy who found him, the courage of Mr. Antonio who took him to the veterinarian, the miraculous turnaround that allowed him to survive. But there was another part of this story that, until then, had not been spoken aloud. Who had done that? The question hung in the air, silent but persistent. Some residents knew, others were suspicious, but fear, or perhaps simple conformity, had kept them silent for too long. Until now. It was on a quiet afternoon, a few days after Phoenix's rescue, that the conversations began. First in whispers, in small comments exchanged at the doors of houses, in markets, among neighbors who happened to meet on the street. But little by little, the whispers turned into firmer speech. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The man who had buried the cub was not a stranger. He was always there, among them. A man who walked the streets with heavy steps and a lost look, the bottle almost always stuck between his fingers. A man that many had seen from afar, but few dared to face up close. And then the reports started to emerge. "It wasn't the first time he did this," said a lady, pursing her lips with a bitter expression. Mr. Antonio, who was listening carefully to everything, felt a cold in his chest. The boy who was sitting on the floor next to Phoenix, stroking his head, looked up, curious and restless. "Like this?" The lady sighed, crossing her arms. "I heard that a few months ago a cat disappeared from the street. It was from a girl who lives 2 houses down from me. A little puppy too. Do you think it was him?" She looked to the side, hesitant. At the time, no one wanted to say anything. But now, it makes sense. Her words sparked something. Other people began to remember strange episodes, of dogs that disappeared without explanation, of desperate barking that suddenly stopped forever. And then came the final piece. "I saw when he caught the cub." The voice came from an elderly man who lived further away. Everyone turned to him, who now held a heavy and guilty look. "I saw him with the puppy in that alley, but I didn't do anything. I thought he was just going to shoo the animal away." He swallowed hard. "I should have done something." Mr. Antonio took a deep breath. He understood that feeling. Regret for not acting, for not intervening. But now, silence was no longer an option. And this time, they had something they never had before. Evidence. There were witnesses. There was a living cub that carried the marks of what happened on its body. There was an entire neighborhood now determined to no longer ignore what was before them. And then, the decision came. They would report it. It didn't matter if the man was known, if he had always been there. It didn't matter if no one had the courage to speak up before. Now everyone knew what he was capable of doing. Now no one was alone in this fight anymore. While people organized themselves to report everything to the authorities, Phoenix slept peacefully in the boy's arms, innocent, not knowing that his suffering had not been in vain, that her pain had brought to light truths that could no longer be ignored, and for the first time, the silence that once hid a man's cruelty was being broken. The truth, when it finally comes out, has a weight that is difficult to ignore. For a long time, that man walked the streets as if he were just another man, as if it were invisible. His steps were staggering, his gaze was empty, his presence was always surrounded by the strong smell of alcohol and neglect. But as the days passed, and Phoenix's name spread as a symbol of hope, something changed. People started to look at him differently, no longer with the indifference of before. Now they looked on with the certainty that they knew exactly what he had done. Every day more stories emerged, reports of small animals that had disappeared without explanation, dogs that used to run around the neighborhood and were suddenly never seen again, cats that used to sleep on the walls of houses and disappeared without a trace. Before, all of this was just a big void with no answers, but now the pieces were starting to fall into place, and what was once just a suspicion became certainty. The neighborhood could no longer remain silent. Mr. Antonio, who now looked after Phoenix as if he were his own son, was one of the first to get up. He was not a man of trouble, nor did he like to get into trouble. But there, sitting on the porch of his house with the little puppy sleeping on his lap, he felt a huge weight on his chest. Phoenix breathed calmly, his little body still fragile, but for the first time, safe. But that didn't erase what had happened. It didn't change the fact that someone tried to steal his right to live. He looked at the boy, who was playing on the ground with a branch, drawing invisible figures in the dirt. Since rescuing the puppy, the two had become even closer. And, although no one talked about it, Mr. Antonio knew that the boy hadn't slept well since that day. I knew that when I closed my eyes, I relived the scene of the little being buried, the desperation of digging, the fear of having arrived too late. It was time to do something. With residents gathered, the decision was unanimous. They would report it. They weren't going to let that go unpunished. The boy held tight to Mr. Antonio's hand as they walked together to the police station. Deep down, he knew that this moment wasn't just about Phoenix. It was about all the animals that were never as lucky. The words came out easier than they imagined. There were witnesses. There were stories. There was a living cub that carried the marks of cruelty on its body. The police officer listened to everything in silence, taking note of every detail, and when he looked up, his gaze was serious. "Let's take care of it." The answer was short, but firm. When the man was detained, no one celebrated with screams or applause. There was no party, just a heavy silence of relief. The neighborhood didn't want revenge. All they wanted was justice, and justice was done. Phoenix would never know the weight of that day. I would never understand the importance of what happened, but maybe, somehow, he knew he was safe now, that now no one could harm him or any other animal. And that night, when Mr. Antonio finally sat down in the armchair with Phoenix nestled against his chest, he felt that something inside him was also at peace. It wasn't just the end of a cycle. It was the beginning of something new, a world where cruelty would not win so easily, a world where there was finally justice for those who could not speak. Some connections just happen. They do not need to be explained. They do not follow any logic. They are like invisible threads that unite two hearts in an unexpected way, crossing any barrier. And between a boy and a cub, this bond was created the moment small hands touched the cold earth to unearth a life that was still struggling to exist. Fate brought them together in a moment of pure despair, but what remained afterwards was something much greater than just memories. The days had passed, and Phoenix was no longer the same. The thin and almost lifeless cub that was pulled out of the earth with effort now gained energy every day. His breathing, once weak and irregular, was now strong. His eyes, which had barely managed to open, now sparkled with childlike curiosity. He was still small, his body still bore the signs of what had happened, but there was no longer any fear in his movements. Now there was life. In Mr. Antonio's house, everything had changed. The simple man, used to spending his days alone, now had a shadow that followed him everywhere. If he went to the backyard, Phoenix would be there, trying to keep up with his steps. If he sat on the porch chair to rest after a day of work, he would soon feel a light weight on his feet. The puppy would curl up there, as if that had always been his place, and when night fell, there was no doubt where the little one would sleep. At first, Mr. Antonio tried to leave him in an improvised bed, but all it took was a friendly look for the puppy to earn the right to curl up in a corner of the sofa, warmed by the blanket that wrapped him on the day of his rescue. But even in the midst of this new routine, something was still missing. The boy had not returned since the day they followed up on the complaint against the man who buried Phoenix. Maybe he was waiting for the right moment. Maybe he was just afraid of what he would find, because deep down a doubt still haunted his heart. Did the puppy remember him? It was on a sunny afternoon, when the sky was a clear blue and the wind was blowing lightly through the trees, that he finally worked up the courage. His steps were careful as he approached Mr. Antonio's house. In his hands, he held a piece of old cloth, a piece of the blanket they used to wrap Phoenix the day he was saved. He didn't know why he brought it. Maybe it was just a reminder. Maybe it was just fear of going empty-handed. Mr. Antonio was already waiting for him on the balcony. He smiled when he saw the boy approaching, but didn't say anything. He just gave a small nod, as if he already knew what the boy was there to do. The boy took a deep breath, feeling his heart beat a little faster, and then the sound of little paws running across the floor echoed through the house. Time seemed to slow down when Phoenix appeared at the door. The attentive little eyes shone for a moment, as if analyzing the scene, and suddenly everything happened at once. The tail began to move frantically, as if each wag was an explosion of joy that had been contained for days. It was a quick, clumsy, uncontrolled movement, as if her entire small body was trying to keep up with the excitement that was overflowing from within. The little ears, previously lying in a lazy rest, were raised at the same moment, capturing every detail of that moment. Phoenix froze for a split second, as if the entire world around him disappeared and everything that mattered was right there, in front of him. And then, without warning, he fired. It was fast, so fast that it seemed impossible for a puppy that days before had barely had the strength to open its eyes. The short pause ran with the urgency of someone who didn't want to waste another second. The porch floor echoed with the small impacts of her nails hitting the wood while her little body, still thin but full of energy, advanced in a straight line. The boy didn't even have time to react. His heart was already beating faster just seeing the scene, but nothing could prepare him for what happened next. In an instant, Phoenix was still at the door. The next, I was already in his arms. The little paws rested against the boy's chest, pressing him hard enough to almost knock him back. The impact was a shock, but he didn't care. Phoenix wasted no time. With his tail wagging uncontrollably, the puppy began to fill the boy's face with quick and clumsy licks, as if trying to put all the wasted time into each one. The boy's eyes widened, his mind trying to keep up with what was happening. He blinked, still in disbelief, as he felt the rough texture of the cub's tongue against his skin. But the surprise was soon crushed by something much bigger, something that squeezed his chest in a way he couldn't describe. His lips parted, and then a laugh escaped. A loose, full laugh, full of emotion. But at the same time, a sob caught in his throat. A knot rose to his eyes, and he didn't even try to hold back the tears that formed there. The crying and the laughter mixed together in a strange and beautiful way, as if they were two emotions fighting to see which one was stronger. And then he hugged him. It was a firm, desperate hug from those who don't want to let go. The boy's arms closed around the small body, pressing it against his chest, as if to assure him that he was really there, that this wasn't just a dream. He buried his face in Phoenix's fur, smelling the soft, warm scent, feeling his little heart racing against his own skin. "You remember me," he whispered, his voice breaking. Phoenix responded in the only way he knew how. More licks, more tail wagging, more little jumps of pure happiness. If anyone had any doubt that dogs remember the people who saved them, all they had to do was see that scene. There was no hesitation. There was no uncertainty. For Phoenix, that boy wasn't just someone. He was your friend, your hero, the first kind face he saw when he came back from the dark. Mr. Antonio watched everything from the balcony, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze calm, a light smile on his lips. He didn't need to say anything. He just watched with the certainty of someone who knew that this reunion was inevitable. Phoenix would recognize the boy, always. Some bonds just don't break, and if anyone still had doubts, all they had to do was look at him now. The boy sat on the dirt floor, his arms still around the puppy, but now without despair, without fear. Just holding on to him because I wanted to, because I never wanted to let him go. Phoenix snuggled against him, breathing deeply, letting out a low sound of contentment, the kind of sound only a satisfied dog makes when he knows he's exactly where he's supposed to be. They didn't need to say anything, neither does Phoenix, because the connection that was born in the most difficult moment of their lives was there, intact, and it would be a bond that would never be forgotten. Stories have a power that goes beyond words. Some are just told and forgotten, while others cross barriers, touch hearts and change lives. And, unbeknownst to you, Phoenix wasn't just a cub who had survived against all odds. He was much more than that. His name, chosen with so much meaning, began to carry a greater weight than anyone could imagine. It all started simply. Mr. Antonio, without any pretense, commented about the rescue to an acquaintance. The neighbor, in turn, was so impacted by the story that he told someone else. And so, like a flame that spreads without control, what happened to Phoenix began to gain voice. It didn't take long for someone to suggest sharing everything on social media. Mr. Antonio didn't understand very well about the internet. For him, stories were told on the balcony between one coffee and another, and not through cold screens. But the boy, who had never forgotten that day and could not forget, knew how much a single story could make a difference. With Mr. Antonio's permission, he wrote down every detail. He talked about the moment he saw the earth moving, about his despair when he dug with his own hands. He talked about the agony of seeing the puppy motionless, of believing that it might be too late. He spoke about Mr. Antonio, the gesture of kindness that changed everything, the desperate race to the vet, and the moment when Phoenix, against all expectations, chose to fight. The post was shared once, then another and another. People read it and felt a tightness in their chest. They cried, they got emotional, they hoped there would be a happy ending. And then they found what they were looking for. Because Phoenix didn't just survive, he was reborn, he found a home. The text went viral. In just a few days, thousands of people had already read about Phoenix. Some commented that they had never cried so much reading a story. Others said that it made them reflect on how many animals suffered in silence, invisible. But something even bigger happened. People started asking how they could help. Some wanted to donate food. Others offered help in taking stray animals to the vet. But the most impressive thing was the number of messages from people saying that, after reading Phoenix's story, they decided to adopt an abandoned dog. Mr. Antonio was surprised by the repercussion. For him, it all still seemed like a great accident of life. But the boy, his eyes shining with excitement, knew that wasn't all. Phoenix wasn't saved for nothing, he said one day, sitting next to the little dog, who was now sleeping peacefully in a corner of the house. He had a purpose, and Mr. Antonio, who had never thought about life that way, realized that the boy was right. That's why, for the first time, he started talking more about adoption, not with big speeches, not with elaborate texts, but in its simple way. If a dog that was buried alive still had the strength to fight, he said, imagine what it can do when it receives love. And little by little his voice began to reach further. The name Phoenix became a symbol, a reminder that no life should be discarded, and all this because a little cub who had everything to die chose to live. And in doing so, he unknowingly became a hero. Have you ever stopped to think about how much a simple gesture can change a destiny? Sometimes we believe that we are just going our way, doing our routine, living our days like everyone else. But without warning, something happens. Something that shakes us, makes us look at the world in a different way. It was like that with Phoenix. It was like that with the boy. It was like that with Mr. Antonio. None of them knew that on that seemingly ordinary morning their lives would change forever. Phoenix was just a cub. He didn't have a name. He didn't have a home. He didn't have anyone. But he had something that no one could erase, the will to live. Against all expectations, against all the cruelty that tried to erase him, he resisted. His story could have been just one of many that end without a happy ending. But by a miracle, or perhaps sheer determination, he was given a second chance. And it wasn't just him who was saved that day. The boy was never the same after that moment when he felt the cold earth between his fingers, digging desperately, looking for a sign of life where there was almost no hope. He always liked animals. He always felt a special affection for dogs, but he had never understood until then the true impact that a small act of kindness could have. He didn't just save Phoenix, he also discovered something within himself that he might never have realized before. The courage to fight for those who cannot ask for help. And Mr. Antonio, he lived years and years believing that his life was already mapped out, that his days would always be the same. But suddenly, a little cub appeared in his path, and he realized that there was still room for something new, something he didn't know he needed. He rescued Phoenix that day, but deep down, Phoenix also rescued him. It brought to your home not just movement and joy, but a purpose, a new reason to wake up every morning. The three, united by chance, now shared an unbreakable bond. The boy who saw in Phoenix's pain a reason to never again close his eyes to the suffering of an animal. Mr. Antonio, who rediscovered the meaning of true companionship, of the pure and simple love that a dog can offer. And Phoenix, who found more than a home, he found his family. If this story teaches us anything, it is that cruelty does exist. There are bad people, people who hurt, who abandon, who try to destroy. But at the same time, there are also those who choose love, who choose to make a difference. Phoenix proved that, even in the face of the greatest evil, kindness can always win. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson a little puppy could leave us. Stories like Phoenix show us that there is always hope, even when everything seems lost. And now you are part of it. Somehow this journey has touched you, even when everything seems lost. And now you are part of it. Somehow this journey has touched you, made your heart beat faster, and reminded you of the power that a simple act of kindness can have. And just as this story reached you, it can reach even more people. By leaving your like and subscribing, you help this message go further, so that more people get to know Phoenix, and so many others who are still waiting for a happy ending. Comment: Phoenix. Lives to show that this story continues to resonate. And speaking of continuing, the next video is waiting for you. A new, even more exciting story that will hold your attention from beginning to end. You won't want to miss it.